And I apologize. Wonderful. I hear a lot of grays are online to see this, and I apologize beforehand because this is going to be a narrow slice of the grays. It's a huge history. This is a family that's spread all over the country, and so what I'm going to be doing is giving you a piece of the Scots prisoner George and some of his descendants here in this area, in this town. And then it's mostly to sort of lay out to you this process. I'm very new to this still. I've just been doing this for a few years, but of how to track down information and solve some mysteries and fill in some gaps. And I've been very happy to do that. So right now I will pop up the slideshow and start from the beginning. And Carrie, you can see that? Fine. Hopefully everybody sees that.
I cannot see it yet, John. Hold on, let me just make sure you are host. You're clicking on share screen and then clicking on the screen itself.
Okay, share screen. I got to do that, right?
Yeah. So go down to share screen.
Yeah, wait a second.
And then it should give you some choices of which screen to share.
Yeah, here we are, of course. First technical difficulties.
That's okay.
Oh, okay.
I begged it for everyone's patience. We should be good.
Mm-hmm. And I've lost my Zoom screen. Where are you? Can you, there we are. Okay. Share screen. There we are. Okay.
Perfect.
Now you're seeing it.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Now in 2000, I grew up in Massachusetts. I'm not a Mainer. I've only been here for most of my life still, but my wife Laura and I moved to this, found this wonderful house in South Berwick on Rodeo Road in 2000. And again, I've been working as an environmentalist, and I worked here in my office as an environmentalist for many years. And I knew some information about the house, but it wasn't until a couple of years before I retired in 2015 when Wendy Persig, who's the former president, with her beguiling, wonderful ways, pulled me into this terrific organization and this wonderful museum. And then I started finding all kinds of wonderful information. It really distracted from the last couple of years of my environmental work. I became so passionate about this. But what you see on the screen is, I believe it's a Greek revival built about 1897. But on the back side, and I think my cursor can be seen by you, this is a kitchen, and there's a back small barn. There's a large barn that's over 200 years old across the street. That was the original farm. This part was on the foundation of a building that burned down in the 1890s, late 1890s, which I believe must have been a cape in one of the first gray houses here. And then they built in 1897, I believe, this Greek revival. Down the road, I've always wanted this on my land, a graveyard, and it's the Grays graveyard. And it's fascinating to have this. When I was, years ago when my daughter was young, we would do some great Halloween stuff here too. This is a gray monument that's in the middle of the cemetery. You can't read it, but it's got some of the Grays etched on there. At the back of the grave is John Gray, who was buried, who's a Civil War veteran. He was a sergeant in the Civil War, and he died in 1905, and he's buried in the back. And then his first wife, Temperance, is buried here, but her stone is not visible. But Roxana, his second wife, is buried nearby him. And what I began initially was trying to figure out, okay, learning about John Gray and the family that was here. And one of the things I like to do when I'm doing this kind of archival research is try to put some flesh on the bones of these long dead people. And photographs are often in scarce supply, even as recently as this picture of John in the late 1800s. But I was fortunate to find a biography that John published, a piece about his life, which really helped with my research and figuring that a lot of the information out. Some of the first stuff I picked up were like hard records. It's been explained to me that it's really important to try to find those records you can depend on, really, really hard records. Here's a copy on the left-hand side of the screen of Temperance Gray's death certificate. She died in 1857. There's no cause of death. John Gray's in the middle, died in 1905. Unfortunately died from cancer and gastric ulcer. Gives you a little piece of information again about these people, helps bring them to life. And then Roxana, who's also is the gravestone, some hard information about her being buried in this graveyard. But there are the stones there too to help prove all those facts. Now, again, looking for information. This is a new piece. I didn't have this the last time I did this talk. John was in the Maine 27th Regiment in South Berwick, of South Berwick, and they were stationed outside Washington, D.C., just as Lee was invading the North and Washington was threatened. And the 27th was sent down to protect the capital. They had an enlistment of a certain length of time. They were asked to volunteer to stay on longer through the threat, and most of them did, including John. But I'd always wondered when I saw this photograph, where in this crowd, John's sitting somewhere in this crowd, where is he? And this year I found at the archives in the counting house, I found a blown up copy of this photograph that was really clear, very, very clear. And what I did was take my iPhone camera and I blew it up and searched the crowd. And because I had that picture of John, I knew what he looked like. And lo and behold, I picked out in the crowd this face that looked just like John to me. But then I was surprised when I came home and compared the photograph with the other photograph of John, and look at the necktie. It's the identical necktie. So I'm very confident that that's our friend John. And I would love for people to be able, with families who had relatives who were in the Civil War, to be able to look at this photograph and maybe compare it with pictures and get another example of their relatives in this reunion photo. Now, after a while, when I was learning about John Gray, and I was working at the counting house with Wendy and Norma and Nicole and Carrie and all kinds of just wonderful people, and I began learning about the Scots prisoners from the Dunbar, the Battle of Dunbar in England in 1650. And I'm not going to focus on that right now. Again, it'd be great if you want to come to the counting house. Nina's set up a wonderful exhibit that deals with that, and that's actually been shipped over by the folks in Dunbar, England, who had discovered the bodies of a lot of Scots prisoners in 2013, I believe was the date. But I was really curious to wonder, okay, is this John, is my John, who inhabited this house with his family, and I'm temporarily inhabiting, is he directly descended from George Gray? And what I'll usually do when I start out my investigation, I'll go to Ancestry, because it's a good source of sort of getting started. But I learned very quickly that Ancestry can be very, very sketchy in terms of its information. And so one, again, needs, what I'll go to Ancestry, I'll look at as many of those records as I possibly can to try to find hard evidence, again, hard evidence, gravestones, paperwork, that kind of thing. And what I found on Ancestry in the beginning was I could see clearly George and Sarah Cooper, and this I have to put a caution to. I've been cautioned by a lot of the Gray family members that there's actually no documentation. I think the Gray families believe that Sarah Cooper was the daughter of Alexander Cooper, one of the other soldiers captured at the Battle of Dunbar, and that she married George, but there's no hard evidence for that. So I've been cautioned by experts not, I should have actually put a caution up there about whether she's a Cooper or not. There's no proof. But if you look on Ancestry, when I looked on, and I'd look at many, but you can see the children, Alexander, Robert, George, Sarah, seems to be, that's probably correct. And then James, now the order of these, their births can differ depending on where you go. James, the first James Gray, his son was James Gray. Well, this is James, and then his son, he had a son, James Gray, who became known for some reason as James Gray Sr., and he had children, including a Jonathan Gray. And then when I looked at John Gray's family trees, I found John and then his father, George, but there was a dead end, unknown father, unknown mother. So there was no connection between Jonathan and George. And so I set out to try to establish that connection. And so that's what I began looking for. And again, with the Battle of Dunbar, it was part of the English Civil War, and Cromwell, Oliver Cromwell, and the Scots were at war with the English and the English parliamentarians, and the Scots assembled a huge army that outnumbered the English at the Battle of Dunbar in 1650, and were crushed in about an hour by Cromwell and his forces, because the Scottish army was composed of many, many young, inexperienced soldiers, and they made some serious tactical errors, and Cromwell had some very hardened troops. So George and a bunch of prisoners, and that's a long story, were captured, imprisoned in a cathedral in Durham, England, and then were shipped out to various parts of the world. And we ended up in New England with many prisoners coming into the Saugus Iron Works, and then later many coming up here to work the sawmills in South Berwick and the area here in York and Dover. So now John, as I'd mentioned before, in 1896, there was a biographical review of sketches of leading citizens of York County. And this is the kind of book that people still put out today, that they'll contact you and say, oh, you're a prominent citizen, you know, give us $200 and we'll put you in this book and send you a copy of it and get it out there. And thank goodness that John did this, because these are based on the testimony of the actual persons. So there were a tremendous amount of important information in terms of who is who here. His great-great-grandfather, Deacon James Gray, because he was deacon of the First Baptist Church ever organized in Maine, and his son, and what happened was James came out here, and I'll show you a deed I found from 1849 or 1749 of Deacon James Gray buying this piece of property and building a cabin, cutting the first tree, fell to the forest here, rearing his log cabin when there were but few settlers in this section of the country. And it was really after the Indian Wars it settled down. So it had been a dangerous territory for anybody, including the natives at that time. But afterwards, when things settled down and the farmers came out of here. Now, James had a son, Jonathan, who was born and reared on this farm. And I love to think of the fact that when these people were here, they were English. This was part of England. It's you know, you forget that sometimes. They weren't Americans, they were English. And Jonathan, born and reared on the farm, afterwards settled on new land in this vicinity, and I'm not sure where that is. He became a large landowner and a local man of importance. He married Catherine Roberts, who bore him 9 children. Now, this is the key thing here. James, Jonathan, George, Nathaniel, David, Caleb, Olive, Sarah, and Hannah. Now, if anybody knew who his great-grandfather's or his grandfather's children were, it should be John. And I compared that then with here an ancestry record. And this is sort of general with the ancestry records. You see a lot of this. You see some crazy stuff sometimes. I've seen records with a child named, I can't think of her name, but her birth date is predates the birth of her father. And that was in George Gray's case, I believe. But here was Deacon James Gray, and according to Ancestry, he had these children: Caleb, James Gray, Mary, Jonathan, and Martha Gray. No mention of George, who's the father of John. But this fills in the missing ones. And George, Nathaniel, David, Olive, Sarah, and Hannah. And missing from this list of John's are Mary Gray and Martha Gray. So that appears to be, that information may be incorrect. So that was my first piece of information. I then went to the census records and pulled, at the time the census were done in those days, the census taker, of course, would go house to house. And this is something that Norma taught me, that if you look on the census record, you can see the neighbors, excuse me, and get a clear idea of where the house actually was. And in this case, in 1790, you see James Gray, who was senior, and James Gray Jr., and they lived near a William Joy here. And James Gray at that time would have been 60, senior would have been 66, James around 40. Now in 1800, we have James Gray Jr., and now Jonathan appears. James Sr. would have been 76 around that at the time. James about 50, Jonathan about 45. George hasn't showed up, he's only 14 at the time. And again, you see William Joy here, living next door. 1810, we now have James Gray Jr., James Gray, who's actually younger in this case. So that may be James Jr.'s son, James, who had a James. This is where it always gets confusing. And Jonathan is here still. And James Sr. is missing, and he died in 1813. So I'm not sure where he went between 1810 and 1813. By 1820, we have George Gray and Jonathan Gray at the house. So again, here's the connection. Here's Jonathan and George. You know, a solid connection between the two of them. And at that time, the James Jr. and James, his son, I believe, had moved way north. And Jonathan and George had taken over the farm. But again, there is some speculation on that. But I have proof that George Gray, who died in 1838, lived here. And that's because he's buried in the graveyard. And I went out today because this is hard to see, and I chalked up the gravestone so you could read it. And then here's another little piece of information. When you see George Gray's wife is often referred to as Teresa or Theresa in records, but here it appears to read Thrusa, which is interesting, whereas John's biography refers to her as Teresa. And I think this may be a case of that perhaps they weren't as well educated at the time, and the name Teresa or Theresa had been somewhat corrupted, but it, you know, it seems clearly it was a Thrusa, which is another interesting piece of information. Now, I've been unable to find the gravestones or graves markings anywhere of Deacon James Sr. He had 2 wives. I don't know where they are, or the graves of Jonathan and his wife, Catherine. But there's a large empty part of the cemetery. And I'm wondering if there might be, at that time they were burying with field stones, and there might be some field stones down there. So that's something I really want to investigate at some point. So I put together, this is my sort of, this is not by any means a classic layout of a family tree, but I was trying to simplify this because I really wanted just to connect John back to George, the original Scottish prisoner. And so I put together this simple chart and managed to fill in that connection between Jonathan and George that I'm very confident about. And then listed their wives, which just gives you another piece of information about how hard it was for women at the time. I mean, here's James Gray Sr., the deacon, married to Mary or Martha Hamilton or Hambleton, Elizabeth Marr, Worcester or Worcester, Hannah Austin, Murray or Murray. Again, names. Jonathan married Catherine, George Gray to Theresa or Teresa. And then John had quite a few wives. And unfortunately, because of the situation, a lot of wives died here. Temperance and Roxana are buried in the cemetery here. Mary Libby is buried in Hollis, Maine. And then Mary Berry outlived John and is buried in Farmington, New Hampshire. Now this is the old map. This is from an actual picture of the old map of from 1795, when Berwick was part of Massachusetts. That the Puritans, Massachusetts, the Massachusetts government, they were real sticklers for documentation. Got all the towns up here to draw maps, and so this is one of the earliest very comprehensive maps. It shows us. This is the Great Works. This is the Salmon Falls River, which was the Newitchewanick at that time. This is the Great Works River. And I blew up this area to show you the area of George Gray's homestall, the original Scots prisoner, who was granted land along with Alexander Cooper and perhaps 12, 13 other Scots prisoners in the town of York, town of South Berwick. And there were others in York and who were granted land. And later, George's grandson, James Sr., moved out to this area, which is where my house is, or the house I'm sharing with all the ghosts here. I haven't seen any, but there are lots of people that have been here before. I feel very honored to be able to be in this house. Now, one of the things I wanted to straighten out too was, and that I found in my research, was Everett Stackpole, who in the early 1900s wrote a really important book, We Rely on Old Kittery and Her Families. And he'd drawn a map showing a lot of the properties in the oldest part of Berwick, 1631 to 1700. And down here you can see some of the Scots prisoners: John Taylor, James Warren, Peter Grant, and over here on Witch Trot Road, you see Robert Gray and John Cooper. And John Cooper was the son of Alexander Cooper, who was the original Scots prisoner, and Robert was a son of George Gray. And they took over those houses. Actually, Alexander Cooper had property down here with Warren first too, and it's sort of unclear if Alexander lived out here or not, but I believe John Cooper did. But anyway, if you see the orientation, this has Robert Gray orientated to the west of the Cooper house. And when I was earlier with Norma going out, we were trying to figure this out, and there was a lot of confusion about that, and we kept looking for for Gray's house on the west side of Cooper's house. So I wanted to dig into that and see what I could find out about that. And so I went to the archives and I stumbled on this wonderful piece, because if you look in, there's a book called the York Book of Deeds, which is an extremely important series of volumes that were put together many, many years ago, where people transcribed the oldest documents. And there, in that Book of Deeds, is a description of Alexander Cooper's lot and his addition that he bought later on what is now known as Witch Trot Road. And then the fact that George and Alexander were granted 60 acres at the same time in 1670. And this is 1671 too, because we were working on 2 calendars at that time. So there was a discrepancy in the years. But this says something illegible. George Gray's grant of 60 acres lays out here, eligible in length, north-south, 50 rods breadth, there being an allowance given for a highway through it, bounded on Alexander Cooper's on the west, and the brook running out of Wilcox Pond on ye south. Okay, that was the first indication. Okay, Stackpole had it backwards. He had perhaps had them in the wrong place. I then went to other books, and this is from the Book of Deeds. And this is Robert Gray's sale of George's homestall to James Gray, his brother, in 1708. And this shows a lot of land that was my father George Gray's homestall lot, bounded on the west by John Cooper's, again, putting the Cooper house on the other side, and on the south by the brook that ran out of Wilcox Pond. And then another one, deed Francis Harlow, who, after George died, his widow, Sarah Gray, married a fellow, Francis Harlow, and he had a property opposite George Gray's former dwelling place to Ye Brook, only parting them. So these were little pieces of information. Now this map is based on a huge parchment, 6-foot parchment map that is up at the Maine Historical Society in Portland. That is just marvelous, and I've had the opportunity to see the original map. But back in the 70s and 90s, a fella came along and he got permission to trace that map, and we have a full-scale tracing of that at the Counting House Museum. And then later he reduced the map in size that had all the names that were in the map. And then later on in the 90s, he decided he put in codes for the lots instead, and then had a key, which we didn't have a copy of that key. So, but what I did was I found out that the Historical Society in Portland had a key to this map. So I can't see the other side of so there it is, okay. Had a key to this map. And so I went up to the Historical Society, I got it, and I looked in that key, and I looked, and the key said, okay, 0219 here, 022C, this is the Great Works River, this is where Witch Trot is. That was Alexander Cooper's lot, 60-acre lot, and this was the addition. And, oh, that's interesting. Okay, wait a second. I'm sorry. Okay. This was Alexander Cooper's lot, and this was his addition. Here's Francis Harlow's lot. What that deed said was he was right across the stream from, I don't actually hear, damn, sorry. Here's the Great Works River up here, actually. And this is the stream out of Wilcox Pond. So here's Harlow on the stream, and he said he was directly opposite George Gray's lot. So I thought, okay, this has got to be, George was on this side. That's got to be George's lot. But when I went and looked at the key, it said there was nothing in this lot. But the author had said, however, the author of the map stated the parchment was wrinkled and worn. No doubt some errors were made in copying. If there are any questions, the original should be consulted. So at that point, I was very disappointed, but I thought, well, maybe there's a small, itsy bitsy chance that there might be something on the big parchment map. So I asked them to pull it out. I had to wait for about half an hour, and they pulled it out, and it was wonderful to see. But I went to that, and right there, you can see Cooper's old lot, Cooper's addition, and right there, it's a little hard to see, but it's George Gray's 60 acres. Bingo, right there. So again, I had solid proof of where George's lot was, and that was very exciting. And even the archivists and the people up at the Historical Society were excited by that. And I'd like to go back, because there are a lot on that other map that say nothing in this lot, and I'd like to go back and look eventually at the whole map and see if we might be able to fill in some of those lots too. Now this is something that Norma discovered, which is fascinating. This is Witch Trot Road today, or in the near past. And this is astounding. This is, we're talking 350 years ago. And here you can see outlines of property. And I believe this is a Goodwin, large piece of Goodwin land. Here is the Cooper land, and here's the Gray land. There were stone walls that were still in existence to this day, and people have been farming this land, and you can see the outlines of the land, which is just amazing, I think, that this kind of, these features survive on the landscape. You see this often in Europe, where they can see old barrows or features that are sort of just differences in the drainage of the land there, and you show up these ancient villages or ancient structures. I then was trying to figure out, okay, where's George buried? Because back on right here between this part, we were thinking initially that the Cooper and the Gray areas, that this may have been Gray land originally, this was Cooper land, and there are these two cemeteries here on either side of a stone wall. They're just field stones. And there was a lot of thought that maybe this side was the Gray cemetery, this side was Cooper cemetery. Now, it turns out, it seems clear these were Goodwins, and this was possibly Cooper's, possibly Goodwins. And then I realized George was buried, his sons moved away, sold the land. His wife, after he died, remarried. So George may have been buried alone. And I'm thinking his lot's over this area, now where his home stall used to be. And so I started looking through our counting house records, our cemetery records, and I found the Goodwin plot, north side Witch Trot Road, just next to the rear of the Robert Howarth, who lived there at the time. And it says there are two stones, Goodwin Bradford S., Benjamin E., and Mary A. Goodwin. And their dates dying in 1851. And then one fieldstone marker without inscription. Now back here, there's a house with a small graveyard that I went to visit. And I found those two stones, and I could not find the one fieldstone. But I'm thinking, maybe that's where George is buried, but that's pure speculation on my part. And maybe if the Scots come over here and we get some permission and they have some money and we can do a dig, we maybe could find George. This is Witch Trot again today. That's where the two, the Goodwin and the possible Goodwin and possible Cooper grave plots are. And you need permission from people to get anything, and please go through us if you want to do any visits to such things. an old Goodwin house. There was Goodwin property over here too. These two houses, they're two houses that appeared to be very, very old interiors and could possibly be one or two Cooper houses, but I'm speculating. Yeah, these two here. I just threw this in. This is interesting. Back in the days with Puritans, if you stepped out of line at all in the early days in 1670s, there's a lot of I've got the main province and court records documents, which are fascinating, and again put some flesh on the bones of these people. And we present Sarah Gray, the wife of George Gray, for breach of Sabbath. They're always breaching Sabbath. And striking of Patience Everington. George appeared for his wife on consideration of her offense and is fined 15 shillings to the county and fees 15 shillings. And then later we present George Gray and Sarah, his wife, for living in fornication before they came into the bands of wedlock. Very typical charge. And there are other ones that are mystifying, where it's got a husband and wife, they're dragged into court for fornication, and it's like, and there's no explanation, you know, what it's the wrong day of the week, you know, what's going on here. It's very unclear. Now, when, and I'm getting close to the end of my time, so I'll have to hurry up here a bit. This is a deed I found in 1749 of Deacon James Gray settling the land, buying land from the grandsons of Roger Plaisted, who was a famous early settler in this area. And this on that, again, that map shows out here where my house is, the Great Works River. This is Boyd's Brook. And this was a Roger Plaisted 100-acre grant. So this is where James came out in 1749 and built his cabin. Now, this was another thing, and I'll just hurry through this fairly quickly, but this was a fascinating thing. Again, just the archives and the counting house were so rich, and I was just so excited about finding things. I stumble on a book, a fire department book, with only like 13 entries in it, dating from the 1896, you know, that era, and for a few years later. And I find wood dwelling, November 19th, 1896, wood dwelling John Gray, total fire, defective chimney. And I thought, oh my goodness, I found the exact date of the fire that I knew from the book that the counting house had put together on place names of South Berwick, that this house had a fire in it in late 1800s. So wow, I had the exact date. But then right underneath it, it says, same date, wood sawmill, Thomas Hilton, caught fire from the building of John Gray. And now I live fairly far off the Great Works River, and I assumed in my naivete that the sawmill might have been down there. So I thought, oh my goodness, this must be wrong. And I was held up for about a year because I thought maybe I had the wrong John Gray record here, until I found, and this has, the John Gray home had been hit by a devastating fire. That's where I got the information. But I found another document when I was searching a Young family for some folks. Around the area were several sawmills aside from the portable mill. Damn, this is so sensitive. Around the area were several mills aside from the portable sawmill used by lumbermen. Among them were Chandler Hilton's on the brook on Rodier Road. Now, Thomas Hilton was the one listed on that fire record. Bingo. So I went over to my neighbors who had sold the barn. My wife and I had sold the barn to. I said, have you seen anything over there? And he said, yeah, I've seen some stones and some bricks and that kind of thing. So I went digging in the archives up in Alfred, and I found a deed. John Gray and his son John W. to Thomas Hilton for an acre of land on the west side of the highway. It was John Gray Road together with a sawmill on land and all the machinery attached, saws, carriages, shingle mitch, shook mitch, boiler, steam engine, really nice operation that in 1886 he's selling for $1,900, which is about $52,000 today. And then 1897, the year after the fire, here is Chandler Hilton selling back a tract of land, the same one that had been conveyed to Hilton by John Gray and John W. Gray, being the lot, being the mill lot containing about 1 acre, and the price was $1. So again, indication, okay, that I got a burnt sawmill across the street here. This was another piece that just sort of I picked up during the last year. Why did the Grays sell the mill to the Hiltons in 1886? And they sold it in January 1886. And then John W. Gray, who was a grown man, died just a couple months later. So I'm again speculating that perhaps John was running the mill because his father was a town official and was running the farm. And maybe this was John W.'s project, and maybe he was sick, maybe he'd been injured. But that was a curiosity that's when they sold the mill to John W. So I went over, asked the neighbors, and I rounded up my friend John, and we went out and we did what some of the archaeologists hate, which is we used a metal detector, and was hits all over that area. And I just happened to pick out an area to first start digging. And we did it carefully, and I laid it out as carefully and did it as professionally as I could. And we found this large piece of metal right about here, just by a happenstance, and then decided to go this way. Boom, we hit a supporting wall. And on this side of the wall was virtually no remnants of all kinds, but in here was loaded with debris. And this again is a very small trench of a large area that hasn't been excavated still. There were brick fragments, machine bolts, and a piece of a sawmill rail. And when I researched it, I could see that circular sawmills at the time, they were selling things like the Ricker sawmill, which up at the museum in the state of Maine in Augusta, they have working models up there. And the rails on one of the models up there looks almost identical to that rail there. And then there was burnt wood, there were nails, there was melted glass, amazing beads of glass and melted glass and broken pottery. So clearly I'd found this mill that had burned down. It was great. I had a lot of fun because I'd go on my dig. I'd pack up my car with all my equipment and drive down the road about 100 yards and then go to my dig site. And then I drew up a rough diagram showing where I'd found everything and made my archaeologist friend, who may be on today, Neil, happy or not as afraid as he was. And I've sort of left that for now because I've found that it's there and I have some other interests. So then I just roughly did this up, and I'm just about done here. This is the barn that's across the street. This is the house. This is the back part with the south facing, what would have been maybe a south facing cape. What I realized shortly after I did this too, that there was a low area in here, and I believe it's the old mill pond. And then the burnt mill site is over here. And this sort of stretches, this is again from a satellite photograph, so it kind of spreads things out a little more. But the sawmill site really lays close to the mill pond. This is where the bridge is and would have been a dam at that point. And then over here is something, my next exploration is I want to look here because I believe that may be where the original cabin was built. And you can see some depressions in the ground, like there was a earth fast or a post hole building there. So anyway, I'm done for now. What I want to do is turn this over